Beautiful Lord's Day. Thank you for choosing to spend it with us in spiritual exercise. I've given you some homework. Who's ready to answer that homework? We're entering into a new study in our series, Speech Seasoned with Salt. So, in conversation with someone, if this kind of question comes up, do you believe that God still works miracles today? Or if it's more of a declarative statement that's made to you and you're expected to pick up with the conversation and just to keep that going, and someone makes a statement along the lines of, God does miracles every day, doesn't he? I mean, how do you respond to that? What do you say to keep that conversation going? What do you say so that your relationship with that person and how you do respond doesn't just all of a sudden implode? What do you think? How would you reply to those kinds of remarks? I know you've been thinking about this over the last week. I would agree with you, and I appreciate that. Okay, so, sorry, my bad. Yeah, we have the mic again. So just to repeat for those who might be listening later, or for those in our class who might not have heard it. So Emily stated, I don't know that I really see the need to contradict what it was that was stated. And I linguistically have a reason for that, and I'm going to guess that you probably do also. Who else? Whether it's in disagreement or a way that you can actually find agreement in what's been stated. Okay, Adam? There you go. That's unifying, isn't it? And that might be an extremely helpful tactic. I'm going to come back to that, okay? Just hang on one sec. Joe, even if it's in disagreement, that's okay. Yes, and nobody's going to disagree with that who's of a religious mindset and who would have brought the statement up to you or asked you the question in the beginning. Good, Joe. Okay, any others? Oh, I'm sorry, Roy, and then we're going to go to Karen. There you go. Yeah, okay. So creation itself being a miracle, super. I like that. Karen? Okay. All right. Okay, so healing that you've received, personal testimony on that. Okay, any others? I want to take two approaches with this. Okay, approach number one. Words are beautiful things, are they not? And they have terrific meaning. There are two different ideas for a miracle as it's defined and is used in our vernacular. So I want to start with the second definition. It's a less than primary one. Such an effect or event, and this is coming from dictionary.com, such an effect, get out of here. By add number 2. I'm just going to get rid of add number 3 for good measure. Take that. Okay, so such an effect or event manifesting or considered as a work of God. Okay, that God's at work. Well, yeah, God's at work every day. Now, in the Bible, we find two ways that God works. And what are those two ways? One of them is directly stated many times. The other one, the exact term that we have for this, isn't ever found, although the concept and definition of it is located from cover to cover of the Bible. What two ways does God work? Okay, he works through people, and just people being here, being born and living. That's not, okay, the arrival itself is supernatural, right? But outside of the arrival, nature can explain people being born, people living after the supernatural acted in creation. So in other words, God is working through people or working in natural ways within the confines of the laws of nature. And what do we call that? What's the label we put on that? You don't find this exact word in the Bible. Providence, but the concept and the definition of it is throughout Scripture. God working through natural means, through the natural laws that he created. Okay. Now, how else does God work in the Bible? In the miraculous. And for that, I want to go in the first, or the primary definition of what a miracle is. So, a miracle is an effect or extraordinary event. And the construct of extraordinary, compound word, ordinary, extra, or beyond the ordinary, beyond the physical, beyond the laws, if you will, of nature. So, an effect or extraordinary event in the physical world that surpasses all known human. Can't use humans to explain this. Or natural powers. Can't use the laws of nature to explain this. It goes beyond them and it defies them. It, for lack of a better way of putting it, violates them. And is ascribed to a supernatural cause. So it's not just the fact that God works, but He's not even using people necessarily to work, or even if people are used, there's no way to explain what people have done. It's something that's beyond them. And again, I would state it violates the laws of nature. And that's where we're going to have our conversation. Now, I do believe there's a way of going about this and stating as he's having a very unifying way, especially if it's a large group and or if it's a catch-22. Use some wisdom in that, and God is amazing. God does work every day. There's no question about that. But let's look into Scripture to see if we can find out more about this. This is the place I like to begin on this subject. And I think everybody of a religious mindset would be on the same page. God absolutely has the power to do anything He wants. He's called the Almighty for a reason. We trust in that. Others trust in that. The limitless power of our great God. If you haven't already, make your way to Job chapter 42. Job 42, where we're going to read the first couple of verses. And of course, this is at the end of the incredible account and the understatement of a lifetime to state everything that Job had been through. At the end of all of this, thankfully things are about to get a whole lot better for them after they've been awful for what appears to be a period of years. Job 42, verses 1 and 2. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know, I trust. And it goes back to an earlier statement that he makes in the book. I know that my Redeemer lives. There's some things that we know. Okay, we know who Jesus is. We know His power. We know what He can do. And this is one of those confessions that Job's going to make right here. I know, speaking to God, that you can do everything. What does that exclude? As the angel explains to Mary, and she's like, well, that sounds really neat that I'm going to have a baby, but how can this be? I haven't been intimate with a man. There are these laws of nature that are in place, and I would have to violate those. I can't do that humanly. I can't explain that. And he says, oh, easy. This is the way it's going to work. God's going to get involved. God doesn't answer to the laws of nature. God created the laws of nature, and the laws of nature answer to Him. I know, Job says, that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can. That's a statement of possibility. It is impossible, God, for anything you want to do not to be done. And it's because you have all power. You are limitless in your strength. It's a beautiful thought, isn't it? And that's just as true today as it's ever been. God's power has not changed since the beginning of time. Time itself has not changed God's power from eternity, from everlasting to everlasting. He is the Almighty. And I think it's vital with whomever we're speaking on this subject that they understand we have the same faith in God exactly that you do. Remember what we've been trying to establish in these studies, which are going to be real-life discussions, is to start in an area where we agree on things. And I think all religious people who have a strong trust in God would agree in His power. He has the strength to do everything. I think everybody of a religious mindset, you might find some on fringes. I mean, it's theoretically possible, okay? But we're probably not going to encounter a whole lot of this of religiously minded people. But you look in the Bible, and miracles are found, and lots of them. So let's take just a little while and look at some of these examples. Matthew chapter 11, and let's start with the great miracle worker himself, Jesus. Matthew chapter 11, and we're going to start reading in verse 1, and we'll go down through the 5th verse. Now this is an encounter, as we're going to find, between some of John's disciples. Which John? I don't know if you want to call him Big John or Little John or Between John, but This is John the Baptist, okay? This is not John the Apostle. But John the Baptist is trying to, perhaps in this effort, shift some attention from himself to the greater in his whole life's purpose. Remember, Gospel according to Luke adult class on Wednesday nights. Verse 1, Matthew 11. Now it came to pass when Jesus finished commanding his 12 disciples, we're going to talk more about those in a moment, that he departed from there to teach and to preach his purpose in their cities. And when John, that's not John the Apostle, this is John the Baptist, when John the Baptist had heard in prison, okay, he's already in confinement, what's about to happen to John the Baptist? Chapter 14, he will become deceased through the methodology of removal of his head. That's exactly true. Well, that hasn't happened just yet, okay? But John's in prison, and he's heard in prison about the works of Christ. Well, everyone's doing works. You and I do works. Works being done all around. Everybody does works. These are unique, though. Why is that? We're going to be told. And when he hears the deeds of Jesus, the things he's doing, he sends two of his disciples and says to him, "Are you the coming one?" What do they mean by that? Are you the coming one, the one who is to arrive? What one's that? Are you the foretold Old Testament Messiah, the New Testament, we call it the Christ, the Christos? Are you that one? Miss Helen? The expected one. Okay, good. So he is the coming one, and the people are expecting this one who is to arrive. They're looking for him. They don't like where they are in first century Roman rule. They want to get out of that. So are you the coming one, or do we look for another? Jesus answered and said to them, I love this, "Go and tell John the things which you see and hear." Jesus very rarely gives a yes or no answer to questions. Have you ever noticed that? Now why do you think he does that? Does that ever bother you? And when you ask someone, it's a yes or no answer, and it's kind of like in court. Okay, yes or no, does this, okay, well, and you go into this 5-minute long explanation at the end. Wait a minute. Why does he do this? It's not good to give a man a fish. Why? He only eats for a day. What you want to do is to teach the man to fish. Why is that? He eats for a lifetime. Okay? He teaches people how to get the food that they need for their souls to survive. And not just through this life, Brad, but in this case, for all eternity. So he says, I want you to go and give this information to John. Just all it is what you've seen and heard, and I want you to use this information to let John decide who this one is. And I don't know if this is as much for John. I think there's a really strong chance he knows the full identity of Jesus by this point, as much as maybe it is for his disciples, which would also make a lot of sense. He and Jesus have this special connection they have from the womb, we know, in Luke chapter 1, and I think that John the Baptist may actually be teaching his own disciples here how to fish instead of just giving them a fish. Hey, go find out more about this guy. Do you think he's the Messiah? Does that make any sense? And so Jesus teaches them to fish also. He doesn't give them a yes or no answer. But he says, you go back and you tell John what it is that you've experienced yourself. The personal testimony of what you've seen and you've heard. Verse 5. What kind of things? The blind see. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised up. And the poor have the gospel preached to them. Now, in this impressive list of things, in the true spirit of Sesame Street, which one of these things is not like the other? What seems like it doesn't belong? The poor have the gospel preached to them. Okay, that's not that impressive, right? The poor can have the gospel preached to them. Hold on, back up just a second. What is gospel? Okay, the good news. When did the good news begin to be preached? Well, that's kind of a trick question. I mean, like full, a little more in its fullness. Okay, there were snippets of it long back when, but remember Galatians 3, Abraham had the gospel preached to him. Of course, you have the spirits in prison before the flood, have the gospel preached to them, 1 Peter 3. Okay, those are just like little advertisements. But like, when's the whole movie come out? The good news. Okay, very good as far as fulfillment goes. But as far as it's the fullness of its preaching, when's the whole message beginning to be brought out? It's his testament and his will at the birth of Christ, especially when his ministry commences. And you're 100% correct, Roy. As far as its total fulfillment, well, it's in Acts 2, and then from that point on. But when the whole movie begins to play, though, is in Jesus' ministry. Okay, so, well, we preach the gospel today. And we do that to the poor, whether you're recognizing that as the economically poor or the poor in spirit, as Jesus would call it. Regardless of whether that's the case, how are we preaching the gospel, though? How do we know what to say? So we have all this in written form. The existence of a book, is this natural? This thing, I can touch it. I can read it. Okay, now, the arrival or the creation of it, that's a different discussion, right? and you know, even the prolonging of it is pretty interesting too. It's continued existence. But the fact that a book exists, you can open it up and you can read it. Human beings do that. We do that every day. That's a natural occurrence. How is Jesus giving this full message? How were the apostles giving this message of the good news? What book were they using? Where were they opening and reading out of? Okay. They didn't have one. And so you see how actually that was a miracle of itself, what Jesus was doing. He has no book that he's opening and that he's reading. I mean, again, technically there are times, you know, in the synagogue he opens up the book of Isaiah and reads from it, that kind of thing. But as far as when he's out, we have no record of any books being used. And yet he gives the most magnificent discourses that have ever been delivered using no book at all by the Holy Spirit and the words that are perfectly being put into his mind. And there's no explanation for that. Things that he hadn't studied yet, the apostles, things that they hadn't studied yet. So you see how that's even a miracle of itself. Okay, so let's look back at some of these things. That is a miracle. Like the other things, even though it doesn't sound as impressive to us, but it really is impressive when you go back and consider how. So go and tell John these things that you have experienced, you've seen and heard yourself. Blind people are seeing. In the case of John 9, the guy had never seen in his life, 40 years old, roughly. The lame walk, Acts chapter 3, Peter and John, silver and gold we do not have, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, stand up and walk. Why is that so impressive, that healing of that lame guy? This isn't something that's come upon him recently. He was born lame, and he's over 40 years old when this miracle is performed. Continue on. The lepers are cleansed. In Bible times, you get diagnosed with leprosy, what does that mean for you? It's a death sentence. You're going to slowly waste away. I like to compare it to consumption or tuberculosis in the American West, the frontier, and how it's a disease. If you're diagnosed with it, you will die. And it's called consumption for a reason. It consumes you from the inside out. Well, this one's a little bit different, and it almost like consumes you from the outside in. But an awful disease. You have to be separated from your loved ones. No problem. Jesus sees lepers, cleanses or heals them on the spot, one after another, after another, after another. There's the group of 10 of them, all of them at once cleansed. The deaf hear. People have never heard a sound in all of their lives. And I really want to emphasize this type of one. The dead are raised up. In the case of Lazarus, he has no trouble in going to a graveyard where there's a deceased body and it's been in the ground long enough that it's begun to decay. And to say, get up, and the body rises up out of the grave. So, yeah, we do have instances of people who have recently died. And then, of course, you could argue the greatest miracle of all, when he is supposed to be dead, and yet he raises himself, John 10, as he advertised, raised himself from the dead after 3 days, brought his own body up out of the grave. These are the types of biblical miracles that we're discussing. Okay, who's performing them in Matthew 11? Jesus is performing the miracles. Is it only Jesus who does these magnificent things in Bible times? Oh, no. Yeah, his disciples also. Go back to chapter 10. Matthew 10, first 4 verses. And when he had called his 12 disciples, these are the special ones, the apostles to him, he gave them power over unclean spirits, demons, to cast them out, and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. And then verses 2 through 4, now the names of the 12 apostles are these: Simon or Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, both the sons of Zebedee, brothers also, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James, Lebbaeus, who's also known as Thaddeus, Simon, and Judas Iscariot. What are they doing, we're told? By Matthew 10. Now in Acts 2, Roy, they're going to start doing a whole lot more than this. But up to this point, they're doing a couple of things. What are the two things they're doing? Okay, they're healing all kinds of sickness, and they're casting out unclean spirits. Now, what kind of healing is this that's going on? Is it somebody who's in a bad spot? And the doctors come in and say, look, the prognosis isn't good, okay? Looks like the person's going to die, and maybe even says he or she has 24 hours to live. And, one of the apostles comes in, they put their hands on them, and they pray. And that night, there's a little bit of a corner that starts to be turned. And then the next day, where maybe the doctors are saying now there's a glimmer of hope. And a week later, okay, the person might survive. And a month later, he or she starts to get some strength back. And is that what kind of healing is going on here? What kind of healing is this? Instantaneous, of people who have 24 hours, in some cases probably less, an hour, minutes left to live. And it's not just that they get better, it's that they instantaneously get better, and it's not like 2 months later you can start to get back to some exercise, okay? It's the next instant later they're playing full court basketball. I mean, that's how much better they get and how quickly. There's no way to naturally explain this kind of healing. Now, does God heal in other ways? Did he in Bible times? Does he today? Absolutely. There are times that God heals. In fact, I think of Hezekiah. He's on his way out. He has this malignant boil, and undoubtedly there's this terrible infection that's passing through his body, and he begs God for help. And God intervenes. He answers his prayer. And how does he get healed? Does anybody remember that one, Hezekiah? He tells them, okay, you need to go get these herbs and put it on the malignant boil, and then he improves and he overcomes that. I don't believe that's an instance of a miracle, that healing. And I don't want to get into trying to argue semantics, but at the same time, just by the definitions of words, not in the strictest sense, because it's an instance in which medicine is used to get better, and it appears there's some expiration of time. That's called God's providence in which he helps. Now, to your point, there's an argument you could say that's a miracle. How? One definition of a miracle is what? Okay, how's the information? So there's maybe some miraculous in that there's a prophet being used. I would agree. That's a miracle where God's directly communicating with a human being. But as far as the healing itself, and what's the definition of a miracle? Not always violating the laws of nature. Just generally stated, it's something, in your words, something awesome that God has worked, something he's done. And it's something that he did in a natural way to heal someone. And there's an aspect even of miraculous there, but the healing itself is very natural. Okay, but the point is this: Matthew 10 is not only Jesus, it's also the apostles, and the type of healing that they're doing, people are instantaneously 100% better, if not better than they've ever been in all of their lives. All right, let's look at one more instance here. Jesus, the apostles, they're not the only ones performing miracles in the New Testament era. Turn to Luke, the 10th chapter. Luke 10, and we probably won't read every word of this, but verses 1 through 9. After these things, the Lord appointed 70. Now, if your translation, it's going to be, I believe, anything other than the King James and New King James. You might have rendered in yours 72. Okay, mine's 70. Yours is 72. What that is a textual variant. And my suspicion is that later on you find he sent them 2 by 2. And I'm going to guess that probably in the manuscripts, that in some copying of them, the 2 probably got transcribed at some point in the wrong spot. And that's where you probably get the 2. Whether it's 72 or 70. By the way, another possibility is 72 may be the exact number, and 70 may be a rounded one, is a possibility also. But nevertheless, if you see that and you wonder why, those are a couple of possibilities. After these things, the Lord appointed 70 or perhaps 72 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go. He says to them, the harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. So I want you to pray the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And you go down in verse 3, your lambs going among wolves. Verse 4, I don't want you to take these things, money bag, backpack or knapsack, sandals. Greet no one along the road. You're focused on your mission. Whatever house you enter, if they're willing to listen, stay there and teach them what they need to know about the kingdom, the good news. I have no indication of books that are being used, but this information is magically being placed in their minds. If they're willing to take care of you, great, eat and drink whatever they offer to you. Verse 9, what's the mission here? In addition to preaching the message, heal the sick there and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. Go down to verse 17. Then the 70, or perhaps you have 72 again, returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. We're told 2 types of miracles that this group of 70 or 72 who are not apostles are performing. What are they doing? 2 things. Verse 9, they're healing the sick. Verse 17, does that sound familiar? What other group's doing that? The 12 apostles, the very special disciple group of Jesus. And so you have them doing exactly the same thing as the apostles are. Lots of miracles being performed in the first century. There's no natural explanation for them. God works through the natural, but that's not what he's doing in these instances. He's violating the laws of nature. He's directly performing supernatural acts that cannot be explained by the power of human beings, but can only be conveyed through a supernatural power, one who has endless strength. These are miracles in Bible times. Okay, so my question to you, and I would encourage you in your discussion with someone, the question to ask them is, well, why does God perform miracles in Bible times? What's the purpose behind it? And you might even preface with this. There are 3 major explosions. Have you ever considered that in the Bible, there really aren't miracles from cover to cover, like at least lots and lots and lots of them? Now, don't misunderstand. There are a lot of miracles in the Bible, but there are 3 major periods of biblical history where there's these explosions of miracles. And you can use them by naming people if you want. What's the first one that comes to mind where you start seeing a whole bunch of miracles? Obviously, creation is a miracle, but you don't have Adam performing miracles and Noah performing miracles. And okay, good. Right around Genesis. Okay, and just a hair, yeah. So at the end of the period of Genesis and just the start of the next book, Exodus, miracles like you wouldn't believe. Okay? What's the second period? You can do it by name if you want. Lots of miracles in the Bible. I'll give you a hint. This is Old Testament also. Their names are very similar, and it's easy for me to get them confused. Okay, good. Elijah and Elisha, right? His understudy is, and I remember that alphabetically. J comes before S. Okay? It works for me. It will for you also. Elijah and Elisha. And obviously, the third major period of miracles, we just read about it, Jesus and his disciples. Outside of that, there are hardly any miracles that take place in the Bible. Isn't that kind of strange? Because you think about, man, it's just Bible times. Everyone's seeing all. In fact, we've been discussing from the end of Malachi all the way to the start of the New Testament, the birth of John the Baptizer, before the angel Gabriel shows up to let Zacharias, John's father, to know that he's on the way. God hasn't even talked to people for how long? 400 years. And we think, oh, God's just, with Adam and with Abraham and with Noah, and he's just talking directly to everybody all the time. No, it's actually a pretty rare thing in the Bible. There are periods of hundreds of years when he doesn't say anything to anybody. In this case, over 400 years he hasn't spoken a word, and that's why it's so exciting when the angel shows up and says, hey, we're picking up where we left off in Malachi, and this is going to be fulfilled, and then boom, the explosion of miracles. We have no indication, by the way, John works any miracles. But Jesus and his apostles and those he sends out work all kinds of... Okay, so the point of which is this. Miracles were always used for a purpose in the Bible. And what exactly is the significance behind them? And before I have you answer that question, I want to show you a couple of things. Turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy 4. This is right at the end of Paul's life. He says earlier in chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, I'm being poured out as the drink offering. The time of my departure is at hand. Fought the good fight, finished the race, kept the faith. Crown of life set up for me, not for me only, but also for all those who love the Lord. Well, at the end of this account, when he starts talking about a lot of people and giving thanks and saying, hey, they say howdy and say howdy back, all that kind of stuff, he mentions this at the end of 2 Timothy 4 and verse 20. He says, Erasmus, he stayed at Corinth. But he says, Trophimus, on the journey, the missionary efforts, I have left sick in Miletus. Time out. You ever thought about this? On the missionary tours, as Paul's spreading the good news of Jesus, he's also performing some pretty cool deeds. What are some things that stand out to you that Paul can and has done? This is at the end of his life. So by this point, what has Paul worked through his hands, God's power behind him? I don't think there's anything that would be left out. Just a few of which we know. You recall he's bitten by the deadly serpent on Malta, the island, and Acts 28, and the natives are like, oh, this is a bad guy. And so they're just eating their popcorn, waiting for him to swell up and die. But not only does he survive, but he never even swells up. And then they're like, whoa, he's a god. Yeah, of course they don't understand, and they need some help with that. But a deadly viper latches onto his arm, shakes it off, and doesn't feel any hurt from that. He's able to restore sight to the blind. In the case of Elymas, the sorcerer, he's actually able to take his sight from him and to strike him with blindness. Who's the guy? Is it Eutychus? Does that sound right? It's Eutychus. Preaching seems boring to him. Turns out to be a little deadly. What happens? Poor old Eutychus. He falls out the window, breaks his neck. However it is, he dies. And Paul goes down and he scoops him up in his arms and he's back and he's just fine. He raises the dead. Magnificent things left and right. And then he has this missionary companion, Trophimus. And he says, I had to leave him behind. He was sick. Well, heal him. Don't you think Paul probably would have done that if he could have? He has all this power at his disposal, but it's like he doesn't have jurisdiction over it. He doesn't get to choose just whenever and however he gets to use that. By the way, this isn't unique in what he does for others. Turn to 2 Corinthians 12. And as you're going there, I want to mention from Galatians 4, it appears that Paul, he refers to this problem he has in his body a number of times as a thorn in his flesh. Anybody relate to that? You have a thorn in your flesh? You wouldn't mind just to shed that if you could. Maybe you haven't been able to. Well, it appears that there's this condition with his eyes to which he makes reference in Galatians 4. And he says, I know you guys and your love for me, that if you could, you'd pluck out your own eyes and give to me. And I believe that's the problem, his thorn in the flesh, at least the most evidence from Scripture. But here's what he says in Corinthians 12, starting in verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure, a thorn in the flesh was given to me. And this isn't God, by the way, who's afflicting him. He calls it a messenger of Satan. God is inherently good. God only does good things. And he only gives good gifts. This is a bad gift. that Saul received. And so he says, this is Satan who is afflicting me with this. A messenger of Satan to buffet me or to keep me in check, to beat me down when otherwise I would be lifted up or exalted. Now, you think Paul enjoys this? And we don't know exactly what this is, but many believe it's a condition with the eyes, and he kind of mentions in Galatians 4, it sounds like it's not pleasant to look at it. And many believe that this is some kind of condition with the eyes that they constantly water and they would mat over. You know how miserable it is to have pink eye? That is like the worst thing, isn't it? Especially if you get that in both eyes and you don't want to be around people because you look awful whenever you have it. It's so contagious. Well, this probably isn't contagious, but it's like the effects of pink eye in both eyes, if this is what many people believe it to be. They constantly mat over and he has to clean them out. And so, no pun intended, he's an eyesore to look at as he's standing in front of people telling them about Jesus. You know how miserable and embarrassing that would probably be? And just a nuisance. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times. I begged him that it might depart from me. This is the same guy who's opening the eyes of the blind who can't even do anything about his own eyes. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. But here's his response. I know Autumn knows this one. It's one of my favorite passages of the Bible. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And so here's the conclusion the man of God draws. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities or my weaknesses, my problems, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For when I am weak, I am strong. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in distresses, in persecutions, for Christ's sake. Again, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Why does Jesus like this arrangement? Is he just a glutton for enjoying the punishment of his children? Why would he enjoy watching Paul, with his problem in his eyes and standing before people and people are like, ugh, watching, and he's maybe wiping his eyes while he's up there preaching his heart out? Why would Jesus let him continue in this? What's the whole purpose of preaching? I think sometimes we miss this. He wants to keep him humble, and the whole purpose of preaching isn't Paul, right? The whole purpose of preaching isn't Derek and the Times, right? The whole purpose isn't Bradley. It's not Joe or Heath or whoever else Chet might be giving the lesson. A lot of times we put the focus in the wrong place, and we love to praise and exalt the person who's standing in front of us. Oh, have you heard so-and-so? He's so great. He's awesome. That's not the purpose of preaching. It's to be able to hear a lesson and to walk away and to be able to tell others, man, Jesus is awesome. That's the purpose of preaching. And people would have done this so much more with Paul if he wouldn't have had an eye condition. Man, have you? And they'd be so excited to show off Paul. I don't think they were super excited to show off Paul to their friends the way that he worked. But they were super excited for their friends to listen to the message that Paul had to bring so that Jesus could be exalted. But the point in all that is this. The guy who is opening the eyes of the blind, striking people with blindness, shaking off deadly serpents and suffering no harm from it, raising the dead, can't clean up his own eyes. And he begs the Almighty, who's giving him the power to work these miracles, please help me out. Work this miracle on me. He says, no, we're going to keep you right where you are. You're exactly where I need you right now. So the purpose of miracles isn't just to give people this ungodly strength so that they can do this and that whenever they want. What's the whole purpose of miracles? What's the design then? To prove the message being declared, the new message, has actually been sent from God. 3 major explosions of miracles. When are they? Repeat to me. Moses, Elijah, Jesus. What's also characteristic around those times? What's being done when Moses is alive? The law, the Pentateuch, the Torah, the Hebrews call it, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Huge expanse. I believe it's something like a quarter, maybe word-wise, of all of Scripture. I mean, it's insane how much huge amounts of revelation over a period covering of, we're at 3,500 years, or excuse me, 2,500 years of history. That's a lot of it. Okay, and we're told that these are the books of Moses. How do we know that God has given this information? You ever look back at the things that Moses did? Look at Exodus chapter 14, or Exodus chapter 4. If you want, you can turn there. I'm just going to give a synopsis of this time-wise. But Exodus 4, there are 3 things. Moses says, hey, whenever I go to these people, they're going to say, oh, yeah, right, God sent you. God hasn't been communicating with his people for a very long time. How do we know for 500 years? How do we know that God actually sent you? And Moses says to God, that's what they're going to tell me. So what does God tell Moses to do? 3 different things. Matter number 1, what does he say? All right, you have a rod in your hand. Toss it on the ground. What happens? Moses, climbs up in the chair. He takes off and running. All right, and I'm going to guess this is probably an asp, which is an Egyptian cobra. You don't mess with these dudes. They'll do you in. Powerful neurotoxic venom. He knows that. And God says, oh, it's fine. Just reach out and grab that snake by the tail. Really? That thing's going to turn around, bite me, and I'm done. But he has the faith, thankfully. He reaches out. What happens to the snake? It's fine. God says, I tell you what, put your hand in your jacket. He brings it out. What's his hand now? Full of leprosy. It's a death sentence. God says, put it back in your jacket. Puts it in, pulls it out. Perfectly clean. No problem at all. God says, I want you to take a cup and dip it in the Nile River. Dips it down and pours it out, and what happens? Water becomes what? Blood. That's powerful, isn't it? There's no natural way of explaining it. Moses doesn't have the power to do it. So the point is, God is working through this man. The people can know that, and you'd better listen to him. By the way, I think it's fascinating. I just want to mention this in passing. So a snake, especially an asp, an Egyptian cobra, bites you, what happens? Okay, we establish you die. Hand jacket pulls it out. You get leprosy, what happens? You die. Okay, and blood being poured out on the ground, blood for human beings is life force, and without it, blood being scattered or poured out, you die. I think he's trying to prove something here through Moses and to the Egyptians. Listen, I have the power to destroy your nation and your entire army. And it's a warning that he's giving to them. But he's able to do all these things. Why? To confirm what he's speaking is actually the truth. Turn to Mark chapter 16. We'll close quickly on these last 2 passages. Mark 16, as you're going there, I want to mention back in verse 15, he says, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every person. One who believes is baptized will be saved. Verses 17 and 18, these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they'll cast out demons. They will speak with tongues. They will take up serpents. Paul, take up deadly serpents. It won't hurt them. If they drink anything deadly, it will not harm them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. Look at verse 19. So then, after the Lord had spoken to them, he ascended. He went up into heaven. He sat down at the right hand of God, and they, the apostles, went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word. How? Through the accompanying signs. Those are the ones of which you read prior. They cannot be explained naturally. To show, listen to the message. What you're hearing about Jesus is the truth. Last passage, Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. 1 through 4, Hebrews 2. Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, to the message that was proclaimed, and to, as we would call it, the Bible, which was written to us, lest we drift away. For if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken to us by the Lord? The emphasis consistently is on the word that has been preached and written to us. But how do we know we should follow it and that it's true? The word that was spoken to us and confirmed to us. How? Both by signs and wonders, with various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit. Not that people could just do willy-nilly whenever they wanted, but according to His own will. Only when He was in agreement for a miracle and His power to be performed. These miracles confirmed new message that was being given from God. Now, we didn't mention about Elijah and Elisha and all the miracles they performed. Have you ever thought about that time frame around 700 to 800 BC? The major and the minor prophets who do all their literary work, most of that, not all of it, but most of it occurs right there in that time span. All this new revelation that's being given. In the time of Jesus and the apostles, what revelation is being given then? The whole latter part, the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and continue all the way down through Revelation. How did people know they could trust what was being spoken and what was being written down in this new revelation? God sent testimony through these miracles being performed. Now, I want to leave you with this seed thought. Today, do we see seas being parted, as in the days of Moses? Do we see entire armies of the earth being swallowed up by oceans, well, seas technically, but without a shot even having to be fired? Do we see people being bitten left and right by deadly serpents, shaking them off, and not even getting sick from it? And I'm not talking about the 1/3 dry bites from rattlesnakes, okay? I would say give me 3 bites from the same snake, okay? And then we're going to fix the odds there. Do we see that taking place? Do we see people who are born blind? This is one we didn't discuss. The maimed or those with withered limbs, and you've seen that before, when there's a hand that's like that of an infant and a hand that's, of course, just normal, like a grown adult, and Jesus could say or just touch, and the other one would grow right in plain sight to be the same size as the other one. Do we see people entering graveyards and say, eeny, meeny, miny, Charles, and the person just rising up? Do we see those kinds of things taking place today? Of course, to ask the question is to answer it. So the question becomes this: why are we not seeing those same kinds of things? Is God working? Absolutely. We have no doubt about that. But why does He seem today not to be working in the same way that He was in Bible times? I ask you to have a formulated response for that. We'll go ahead and have you say the memory verse, if you don't mind. 1 Corinthians 13:10. But I'm going to give you a new one also that corresponds with that. Ephesians 4:13. Ephesians 4:13. But how do you respond to that? God still has the same power. Why are we not seeing that same power of God being worked today as we saw in Bible times? We look forward to your responses next week. Thanks.